It has long stood as a bastion of justice, interpreting the Constitution and safeguarding the rule of law. But according to a recent poll, the majority of Americans no longer have confidence in the Supreme Court making the right decisions on legal cases related to the 2024 elections. It's time to wake up, Washington. Faith in the country's highest court continues to crack. Even more Americans are questioning its impartiality and integrity after some high-profile rulings and cases, from abortion to January 6th. And lawmakers are putting the court under the microscope.
The 9 justices on the Supreme Court are members of a democratic form of government, not royalty.
This is about an ongoing effort to destroy this court.
They should be held accountable, as all public servants in the federal government are held accountable.
The justices have proven their sobriety and their judicial temperament.
These individuals continue to detonate the credibility of the United States Supreme Court.
But how much of this is political? We spoke to Americans from across the country to see how they are feeling about the nation's highest court.
I don't have very much trust in the Supreme Court. I think that there should be term limits. I think it's time to reform the Supreme Court.
The American people need to be able to trust you as an impartial arbiter of the law, and right now it just doesn't look that way.
I think there should always be a code of conduct, and ethics should definitely be involved.
Well, it's not the Supreme Court that I trust. It's the people that's in the Supreme Court.
I don't see where we're going to go forward with any meaningful movement in government if all we're doing is, clan against clan, warring against each other, trying to get our way.
Joining us now, Princeton University political scientist Dr. Wright and constitutional law expert, criminal defense, and civil rights lawyer Robert McWhirter. Both of you, thank you so much for joining us. I want to go over some recent stats. The Supreme Court's approval rating fell to a record low of 40% in 2021 after it refused to block a controversial Texas abortion law prior to overturning Roe versus Wade in 2022. And a more recent Gallup poll has the court's approval rating at only 41%. Robert, I want to start with you. How concerning is this lack of faith in our country's highest court, and have we seen this at any other point in U.S. history?
Well, I think it's very concerning. I don't think it's surprising given what some of the justices have done and where their opinions have gone, but it's very concerning because, faith in the court is part of the rule of law. We depend on the court to kind of be the final arbiter of the great just issues of our day, and we want them to be fair and feel like they're balanced. As far as in the past, the Supreme Court has suffered worse. Right after the Dred Scott decision in 1857-58, the court suffered, and after the Civil War, the court kind of suffered for some time because of its adherence and acceptance and approval of the doctrines of slavery. That when the country moved in a different direction, they kind of had a pro-slavery group cemented into the court. And so the court lost tremendous prestige at that point. But over time, it's kind of rebuilt that. But right now, it's at a phase where, at least in modern history, it's never quite been this low. And that's problematic.
Yeah, it seems like there's some eerie similarities there in terms of, during the Dred Scott decision and today, the country was very, very divided in both periods. So definitely concerning to see that trend. Lauren, 39% of people say the high court is too conservative. Do you think the Supreme Court has risked turning into a political institution in recent years, or has it already turned into a political institution with candidates for president constantly invoking the nominations of justices?
Well, of course, it's been perceived as political, but there's very little the court can do to change that because the lifetime appointments or the appointments on good behavior, as the Constitution has it, are cemented in stone. And so that's actually to protect the court from the whims of popularity, to keep the independence of the justices. And so, it's expected that at certain times it'll be more or less popular. But yes, absolutely, the signals are there. The appointment process, for one, has become extraordinarily politicized. The president's staff and resources poured into these Supreme Court appointments are as political and as huge as they've ever been. And that appointments process has become fodder for national conversation. We can also very reliably predict the votes of justices just depending on the party they were appointed by. But I'll just provide, some context by saying the White House would be happy with a 40% approval rating a lot of the time. Congress would be thrilled. They have a 13% approval rating, and that's the lowest it's been in more than 10 years. And so even though the Supreme Court is suffering, and a lot of people do perceive it as untrustworthy, it's not as bad as some of our other institutions, believe it or not.
That's very, very important context. Thank you for pointing that out. Robert, I want to move on to how some of the individual justices themselves have found themselves in the political spotlight. We know there have been calls for Justice Samuel Alito to recuse himself in the upcoming January 6th cases after multiple flags seen at the January 6th insurrection were spotted flying at two of his homes. What's the case for recusal here? And do you see Alito reversing his decision in the future not to recuse himself?
Well, to pick up on your last question, I do not see Samuel Alito ever recusing himself on this. I think that Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas feel like this is their moment. They have waited for decades to get the votes on the court to do what they want to do with the cases they want to do it. And I don't see them ceding that for any reason. As far as the issue with the flag, it just looks bad. Those are clear political statements, and justices work very hard to avoid that. Now, he is saying that his wife did it. Look, I mean, if you're a Supreme Court justice, your spouse kind of has to be careful too. They have free speech rights, and everybody knows that. Maybe that's a marital issue between the two, or maybe Justice Alito just really actually doesn't care because he knows he's untouchable. The odds of him getting impeached in the current political environment for that issue are very low. And as Ms. Wright just noticed, he does have life tenure. And life tenure doesn't mean what it used to mean because people live a lot longer now. So life tenure means a long time for these justices. So I don't see him stepping down. And I think he's just going to go right on forward because this is his chance to re-engineer America the way he sees it. And Clarence Thomas is right there with him. His wife, Jenny Thomas, has tremendous problems and is potentially going to be indicted. But he is perfectly happy to sit on that court, and there's really nothing you can do to dislodge them.
So, Lauren, on that point of the Thomases and the Alitos and really any spouse of a Supreme Court justice politically, how does that, how do justices handle this issue of the free speech of their spouses, or how should they handle this? Is there really any guidance?
No, there's really not. And I've written a book on first ladies, and so I'm keenly aware of the power of political spouses, and especially over how institutions are perceived. But there's not much the justices can do about this, except in the capacity of their personal relationships at home. But it does have an extraordinary negative impact on the way the court's perceived. And so it does hurt the view of the institution, which, as we just talked about, is actually a little bit better than Congress, a little bit better than presidents in recent years.
So, Robert, I want to move to a slightly different topic. President Trump has called on the Supreme Court to decide his hush money case. How much of a long shot is that, and does it put the court in yet another difficult spot politically?
To say it's a long shot is actually an understatement. What would have to happen is Donald Trump would have to, through years and months and years, go through the entire appellate process of the state of New York. Then he would have to file some kind of habeas corpus motion or something like that in federal court, alleging that some kind of federal constitutional right was violated, which is pretty dubious even at that. And then it would have to go through the federal court process before it would ever get to the Supreme Court. There is a possibility that the Supreme Court could reach down and grab it from a federal district court, but there's really no precedent for or law that allows them to reach down and grab a case out of a state court, except in the most rare of circumstances would that ever happen. So I just don't think that happening. And the voices on the court for a kind of more measured approach, such as John Roberts, would be opposed to doing such a radical procedural departure as all of a sudden deciding this for Donald Trump. It just has a bad look. I mean, it's kind of like, well, I put 3 of the justices there, so they're beholden to me, so they should take care of my New York trial. That's kind of a bad look, and if the court is sensitive to its own legacy, they should really avoid that. And I just don't see a procedural mechanism for pulling it off.
Lauren, I want to ask you about the relationship between the justices and Capitol Hill, specifically Senate Democrats. We know that Democrats in the Senate Judiciary Committee had asked John Roberts, the Chief Justice, to meet with them over the Alito scandal and controversy. But John Roberts said he would not meet with them. Should he have granted them a meeting, or would it have been seen as too political ultimately?
It would have been perceived as political, and that's what his reasoning was. He's well known as a fierce protector of the independence and the reputation of the court, and so he really leaned on that, and he said, except for rare ceremonial occasions, we should not have these kind of meetings, and because only one political party is present, that's all the more reason to avoid it. So that's understandable. And there are some positive things here, Julia. The court is dominated by conservatives, of course, but on huge issues recently, like immigration, Native American rights, voting rights, the influence of state legislatures in our elections, they have voted with some of the liberal justices. And Kavanaugh, for instance, the most contentious hearing we've perhaps ever seen, votes with Justice Jackson over 60% of the time. He votes with some of his conservative members, Thomas, for instance, less than 50% of the time. So there are a lot more alliances than we often give the court credit for.
Yeah, I would encourage our viewers to look at those voting records and, see where the justices are falling. So, Robert, where does the court go from here, and how can it regain the trust of Americans no matter, what part of the political spectrum they fall on?
Well, I think the court right now, by design, and this has been a design from the Federalist Society and Mitch McConnell and his allies for decades, to get the court that they want to get. I think there has to be a little more balance on the court for it to be back kind of in the mainstream. It's not just out of the mainstream of, I think, the American people, but it's out of the mainstream of most political thought, most kind of scholarly thought. This is a court that is way, way to the right of America and way to the right of the consensus about a lot of issues. This is a court that's hearing issues that nobody even thought would be subject for discussion before. And I think you have to have some balance put back in the court. The big example, and you could give many others, is the Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade is an opinion that is really far to the right of where the American people are, as is evidenced by what's been happening in the political process as we've gone on. So I think to regain that trust, the court has to be brought more back toward the middle, so it can be viewed as kind of a fair broker on these issues.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Robert McWhirter and Lauren Wright, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Great pleasure.
Last month, the Supreme Court received backlash from some on the left when justices voted along ideological lines to overturn a lower court's decision approving a congressional map that some claimed was gerrymandered. What exactly does that mean for voters both in the Palmetto State and across the country? Staff writer Rafael Bernal has an in-depth look at what gerrymandering is and how it could impact the upcoming election.
Gerrymandering isn't the problem you think it is. The practice, politicians choosing their voters rather than the other way around, it happens in 40 states. In the other 10, a commission without politicians draws congressional district maps, in theory to make them fair and compact. Missouri and New Jersey have commissions of politicians, and Virginia has a commission that's half and half politicos and civilians. Everywhere else, they fight it out with legislatures and governors trading vetoes and overrides. Gerrymandering boils down to cracking and stacking. In cracking, politicians split up communities they think will vote for the other party and turn those segments into minorities in districts full of the right kind of voters. Stacking is the opposite. Politicians take all their party's voters and draw a line around them, no matter how squiggly, to build a safe district. But there are pros and cons to squiggly districts. Some minority communities might never get a chance to elect representatives if they weren't tied together in one same district. So what's the problem? Well, for one, gerrymandering around the country means the popular vote isn't reflected by the composition of the House of Representatives. That has happened 5 times since the year 2000. In 2000, 2002, 2004, 2012, and 2016, Republicans got less than 50% of the popular vote in House elections, and they still controlled the chamber. In 2016, the GOP's share of House seats was 7.1% bigger than its vote share. Democrats in 2008 got 6.2% more seats than votes, but they would have won a majority anyway. That could seem strange, but House seats are not assigned by national popular vote. Much like a presidential candidate can lose the popular vote and win the Electoral College, these are the agreed upon rules. The real problem, according to a 2023 study by Harvard, is that gerrymandering creates safe districts for incumbents. The researchers coded a districting simulation tool called Redist, and they redrew the country's electoral maps as they would look if all House districts were determined by nonpartisan commissions. The result? Well, the House would look pretty much the same as it does now. But it might not look the same for the 19 representatives who are running completely unopposed this year, or the 3 who only have a third-party opponent. Even 4 other seats, they have a general election between 2 candidates of the same party. Still, there are places that aren't gerrymandered that are safe for one party or the other. But heavy gerrymandering does create safe seats. The Princeton Gerrymandering Project assigns grades to states by mathematically judging how they draw their House and local legislature maps. And those grades, they sometimes have real-life consequences. For example, Texas gets an F on its House maps, and about a third of this year's uncontested races are in Texas.
Former President Donald Trump will be headed into the 2024 presidential election as a convicted felon. Trump, who was found guilty of 34 felony charges, will be sentenced July 11th, just 4 days before the Republican National Convention. While GOP lawmakers have rallied around the former president, will voters? And the war cries continue from Trump, who has continued to accuse Biden of being directly involved with his prosecution, all without evidence.
And it all comes out of the White House. Crooked Joe Biden, the worst president in the history of our country.
Make no mistake about it. I'm here because of crooked Joe Biden.
Biden stayed quiet during the trial, only speaking out after Trump's conviction. But let's wait and see how the president really feels about his political opponent's trial once he has an open mic during the first presidential debate, June 27th. It's time to go on the record with Scott Tranter, Director of Data Science from Decision Desk HQ. Scott, as always, thank you for being here. Let's get right into it. What impact is Trump's guilty verdict having on voters?
So far, nothing. We ran the model last week. We had Trump at a 58% likelihood of winning. As of this morning, he's at 56%. The things that happened over the weekend are Donald Trump raised $200 million, or purportedly raised $200 million. The dirty secret behind that is he's kind of been behind fundraising so far. So the $200 million brings him in parity. So the model looked at that. And then we've had about 4 polls come out. And by and large, the top lines have stayed the same. It looked like a little bit of the crosstabs around independents may have moved around, but none of the top lines have changed. Now, we might get some individual state polling here later this week in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, these battleground controlling states. But right now, it doesn't look like the verdict has really changed any voters in any significant fashion.
Yeah, that's what I'm most interested in, how this is going to play in the states that will ultimately decide the election. But I want to stick with some national level polling that we've seen so far. A Reuters poll found that 10% of Republicans said they were less likely to vote for Trump now that he has been found guilty, while 25% of independents said the same thing. Scott, is that 10% of Republicans saying they would be less likely to vote for Trump, is that going to cause a problem for him in the general?
It will, if those less likely become definitely don't vote for Donald Trump. Less likely, I always like the phrasing these questions. Less likely, of course, you're going to get some people say, yeah, consider him last, but let's see what happens when they go into the ballot box. Generally speaking, if you've been voting Republican 4 or 5 cycles in a row, it's going to take quite a bit for you to not to vote Republican this time around. But that is something to worry about. Look, we're looking at an election that's probably going to be decided by 5, maybe 6 figures worth of votes, so tens of thousands of votes. 10% of the Republican electorate in a state like Pennsylvania could be the difference in that state.
Jury selection started in Hunter Biden's trial this week in Delaware. Scott, will this have any impact on voters at the ballot box, and how could this impact compare with that of the Trump trial?
Yeah, look, the polling on it is tough, mostly because not a lot of pollsters, ask a lot of questions about the president's son, who has no official role in the White House. And obviously the Republicans in the House have pushed pretty hard to say that, there was some undue influence and things like that, but that's not what these trials are about. They're certainly a distraction. I'm sure they're not something that Hunter Biden or the Biden family wants to go through, but by and large, voters aren't really paying attention, and it's not really impacting their vote. But it makes for a lot of good news stories and flashy headlines.
Yeah, he doesn't have an official role, but Biden very much embracing his son. We see Hunter Biden at the White House quite a bit. And First Lady Jill Biden was in Delaware for the start of those deliberations this week, so something to keep an eye on. Shifting gears, President Biden announced an executive order on the southern border. Is this being seen as too little too late? And is the hope to increase support in states like Arizona, which are very much impacted the most by the situation at the southern border?
So your last question first. Absolutely. That's exactly what the executive order is. It's a play for voters. And, too little too late. Some voters are going to look at that, right? The Republicans have been saying the president can do something at the border without legislation. And the president has basically been saying the last 6 months to a year, no, I need legislation. So the fact that he's come around to an executive order is pretty political. But we're in a political year. Something's better than nothing. I think that's what the Biden campaign's hoping to resonate with some of these independent voters. We'll see if it works or not. But it certainly is a political ploy to go after some of these state voters in states like Nevada and Arizona that are going to be crucial for President Biden winning re-election.
I want to shift gears from presidential politics to Senate politics. Former Maryland governor and current Senate candidate Larry Hogan said that the jury's decision in Trump's hush money trial should be respected. But that, of course, earned the wrath of the Trump campaign and many of the former president's allies. On the other side of this, though, Montana Senator Steve Daines, who is also chair of the Senate Republicans' campaign arm, said he supports Hogan. Scott, how are Hogan and Republicans threading the needle on this verdict, while at the same time, threading the needle on other issues that sort of impact Maryland Republicans differently than in other states?
Threading the needle is an interesting way to put it. I almost put walking around on eggshells, right? Because we'll see if they actually thread the needle on it, but they're certainly trying to step carefully here because, look, Larry Hogan, if he's going to have a shot to win in Maryland, isn't going to do it on the coattails or, standing next to Donald Trump. Maryland's just too democratic, and that's not how Larry Hogan won the last couple times he was governor. Republicans more broadly, they want to take the Senate, and they probably don't need Larry Hogan's seat to do it, but never be too safe or having enough backups. And so I think that's where a lot of the issue is. We'll see, the Trump campaign. I saw that tweet just like you did, few minutes after Larry Hogan put out that statement. I didn't read it as attacking Trump. It was more support rule of law. La Savita, the Trump campaign manager, basically said his campaign was over. And then Laura Trump kept the message up over the weekend. So this is going to be a thing. This is not the last time we're going to hear about this, and probably not the last Senate campaign we're going to hear about this, going forward. Nevada, which could be another close race, may or may not, may go the same way as Maryland is. You might have a candidate there need to thread the needle a little bit. But yeah, this is going to be a storyline between now and the end.
Sticking with the mid-Atlantic states, I wanted to get your take on Virginia, which Democrats have recently held on to in presidential elections, but Republicans have seen some victories, notably Governor Glenn Youngkin's election in 2021. Scott, a recent Roanoke College survey released last week found that Biden and former President Trump were tied at 42% in Virginia. How worried should Democrats be? And is this a sign that Biden's, weak nationally overall? Is Virginia sort of reflective of that?
Yeah, so it's funny. We have the Hill DDHQ average, and right now it has Biden +1 in Virginia, and it got a little bit of noise on the internet the last couple days. And, this is why we like the data. Look, the polling says right now that Joe Biden has a 1-point lead, but we look at the forecast model for whether or not Biden is going to win this fall. We still have it at Biden in the mid-70s chance of winning Virginia this fall. And so I think that's a better measure because that encompasses everything about Virginia, not just the polling. It encompasses the fundamentals, the fundraising, historical, and things like that. And so that's a long way of me saying is, look, the polls are close now, but that's probably not how it's going to be this fall. And we're going to see some of this separate. Obviously, it's something to watch, and this could be a change election for a state like Virginia. But history and the fundamentals tell us it's probably not.
Well, Scott Tranter, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for What's America Thinking. I'm Julia Manchester. Come back next week. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel.